Okay, it's time for our last video. I'm just going to be talking about future topics that I didn't necessarily attend to that I might want to attend to in the future. And if we get enough comments and likes and all those good things here, I might go ahead and attend to them. So, the first two things would be consistency and bias. So, bias and consistency. So bias and consistency of estimators. This is almost generally this is like the first thing in general statistical inference that people cover. And it's not super necessary here because the only estimator that we are using is the plug-in principle. The plug-in principle under some mundane assumptions is always consistent. That being said, it is not always without bias. So we didn't cover those things. It might be good to cover them in the future. I'm not sure if you guys would be interested in this. It might also put this in frame of reference of like a general statistics class. These have to do with how good the plug-in principle is as an estimator compared to other ones. Okay. The other thing that I would be very interested in doing, but just didn't really have enough time to, and because we didn't cover bias previously, would be using Bootstrap to estimate bias. And this is kind of one of the cool things. So even though the plug-in principle can be biased, you can go ahead and use a Bootstrap estimate to estimate the bias and then do calibration afterwards to get a sample size where you wouldn't have the bias you actually observe. So it's kind of like, okay, the plug-in principle can be biased, which is bad. For those of you that sort of don't know what bias necessarily is, bias is a bad property of estimators. It means you're a little bit off. But we can go ahead and because the plug-in principle is consistent, we can go ahead and we can use Bootstrap calibration we can use Bootstrap to estimate the bias, then we can use Bootstrap calibration to go ahead and correct for it. And also just sort of generally speaking, the bias corrected, accelerated Bootstrap, explicitly does these sorts of things. Another thing that I was interested in covering and didn't get time to is IID. So IID. One part of me feels like I really did a disservice to sampling during this class. And I think there needs to, maybe I will just go ahead and do a separate other class on sampling itself because sampling is just so interesting. It's quite an in-depth topic. The only thing I covered here was that random samples were good. I didn't really explain why, other than we need random samples for sort of the plug-in principle to necessarily work. But IID is one of the properties that we can have instead of the property of quote-unquote random sample. They'll get the plug-in principle to work as well. So anyways, this is a property of basically sampling. And then the final thing that I did not do was Bootstrap hypothesis testing. Hypo testing. This is one of the ones that I chose not to put in here. I feel like these first three didn't necessarily fit in. This one feels so big that I didn't want to include it in. This one I actively did not want to include it in. I'm honestly not the biggest fan, so there is some debate on, well, not really some debate. So I'm not the biggest fan of Bootstrap hypothesis testing. I'm not really a big fan of hypothesis testing in general as compared to using confidence intervals. I think assuming the null is kind of, it feels a little weird to me. I'll attach a few articles that can sort of justify some of my assumptions here. But anyways, I chose not to include Bootstrap hypothesis testing for various reasons. One is because it's incredibly confusing because you need to sample under a null hypothesis, and that seems pretty weird. And two, because I don't think it's relative. It's not as important as some of the other stuff that I covered. So please don't get offended by that. Maybe it is really important. Maybe I should have included it. Please just let me know in the comments in as humane and civil a way as possible. So if any of you would like to see these types of videos, the bias, the consistency, and the Bootstrap estimate of bias, please go ahead and add a comment down below. And if there's enough, I can go ahead and tack them onto the series. For those of you that might be interested in an entire series on sampling itself, you can go ahead and add a comment down below and go ahead and give a lot of likes to it. There would need to be a lot of likes for me to go ahead and do this because I would need to go ahead and do some good research on my own. And then finally, for those of you that think that I should have included Bootstrap hypothesis testing, please civilly disagree with me here, and maybe I'll hear you out and I'll go ahead and add it. I hope this has been as fun for you as it was for me making this, and I hope you can continue to tune in to some of the future episodes that we do, because I'm certainly hoping to make this sort of a full curriculum in data science. And for those of you that have stuck with me from the beginning, I certainly hope that you've seen some growth in this area. Okay, thanks everybody, and I hope to see you during the next, I believe it will be causal inference lectures. Thanks.